I'd like to take a moment now to introduce the president of WFOIC, Bill Lueders.
Ooh. So I really need to give some thanks to Ken and other members of the National Freedom of Information Coalition, Denise Myers, Drew Griffith, Leanne Wiseman. I was involved in enough of the email correspondence to know that there was a tremendous amount of work that went into organizing this summit, and they did most of it. So let's thank them. There are two reasons, I think, that this convention is being held in Madison. The first is that Madison is a great place to have a convention, and we hope you're enjoying your stay here. We're very proud of our city and our state, and we welcome every opportunity we get to show it off. But there are other reasons that Wisconsin is in the limelight these days with regard to open government, and most of them do not make us proud. In the past year, we have seen state lawmakers contend, and the Wisconsin Supreme Court agree, that the legislature can violate the state's open meetings law with impunity. We've seen citizens dragged from the state assembly for taking pictures. We've seen photojournalists arrested for filming news events. We've seen a redistricting process conducted with such deliberate secrecy as to draw the ire of a federal court. These lapses make me embarrassed for my state. But I feel compelled to point out that there is a perspective that they should be viewed within, one that is part of a larger message. The contempt that has been shown in some quarters for our state's traditions of openness, while it demands our attention, does not define us. It is not typical. It is not common. It is not Wisconsin. For every public official who seeks to operate in secret, there are many more who accept and even appreciate their obligation to conduct the public's business in public. I believe in my heart that openness is good public policy. Openness serves the interest of the government as well as the governed. Openness breeds trust and protects the reputation of public institutions. And I think the vast majority of our public officials would agree, from Attorney General J.B. Van Hollen, who talked to us last night, down to the average member of a city council or school board. Openness is part of our state's heritage because we've tried it and we like it. Indeed, this is part of the larger message I would like to bring to advocates of open government. It's like that old saying about being a parent, catch your kids doing something good. Too often, I think those of us committed to transparency are focused on those instances where opaqueness occurs. But what I've learned in my 2 decades of involvement with the Wisconsin Freedom of Information Council is that the most effective way to advance our cause is by identifying and celebrating those instances in which government works as it should, in the open, for all to see. Public officials, for the most part, are eager to see themselves as being on the right side of this issue and are often open to the guidance we can give. They need to know that their commitment to conduct the public's business in public is noticed and appreciated. They need to know that we would like to count them as our allies. I realize that all of you can identify public officials in your state who do not merit positive recognition. So be it. Let's reserve some of our attention for those who do and try to win as many converts as possible. Thank you.
I've had the great privilege and pleasure of working with Lucy for more than a decade on the NFOIC board. And I've also had the great privilege and pleasure of working with her as a reporter and editor with the Reporters Committee. And I can tell you, she is one of the most dedicated, passionate, selfless, helpful people that I know. She's on the road. If any of you know her, she's on the road all the time. In fact, probably half the conversations that I've had with her over the years, she was never in Washington. She was someplace else, on her way to someplace else. And I've run into her someplace else on more than one occasion. But when you ask her to help you, when you ask her to speak or show up at your event, she does everything possible to try and make that happen. And not everybody does that. There are lots of ways to avoid calls if you're in her job. And if we could find, and when you are fortunate to get her to say yes, and a lot of you folks in this room have been fortunate to have her say yes, you know that you can breathe a big sigh of relief about your event or your luncheon or your gathering, because even if you're not prepared, she usually comes to the table prepared and she makes you look good. So, and if we could find a way to corner her into spending the rest of her adult ambulatory life as part of the NFOIC board, I think we probably would. But after 17 years, I think she has a right to dedicate herself a little more to some of her many other commitments, and I think we have to let go. So personally, on behalf of the board, on behalf of myself, on behalf of the NFOIC membership, I just want to say thank you, Lucy Dalglish.
My name is Mitchell Pearlman, and I'm on the Board of Directors of NFOIC and also the Connecticut Foundation for Open Government. And it's my job and pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker. A wise man recently wrote, and I quote, "The First Amendment's role in protecting free speech is to shelter remarks that most people don't like. Words that everybody finds acceptable need no defense." The wise man who penned this all-too-true aphorism is our keynote speaker today. Gene Policinski is Senior Vice President and Executive Director of the Freedom Forum's First Amendment Center, located at Vanderbilt University in Washington, D.C. He's a veteran journalist who's worked in newspapers, radio, television, and in online operations. He has the waterfront covered. He co-authors a weekly newspaper column, appropriately entitled Inside the First Amendment, and is executive producer and a narrator of a touring multimedia production called Freedom Sings. Again, very appropriate. Mr. Policinski came to the Freedom Forum in 1996 from USA Today, where he was one of its founding editors. He's a member of the Board of Directors of the Association of Opinion Journalists Foundation, a trustee of the National Academy of Television Arts and Sciences, a member of the American Society of News Editors, and a member of the Board of Advisors for the Institute for Media, Culture, and Ethics at Bellarmine University. In his obviously enormous spare time, Mr. Policinski is also an adjunct member of the Winthrop University, and this year will teach at Middle Tennessee State University. Quite a resume, and so we're very honored, and I'm very pleased to introduce Gene Policinski.
Clearly just an old guy who can't keep a job, I guess, I could have summarized that for you. It's USA Today fashion, you go to. It's nice to be with you. It's great to be with people who are concerned about something that all too many of our fellow citizens aren't, which is that ability to pry from the cold hands of bureaucrats and sometimes the grasping hands of government officials information that we need as citizens to really live up to the vision the founders had for this country. And that's really what I think you're about. It's why I'm so pleased and proud to actually have been invited to talk with you for a moment. You know, the keynote is a challenge when you realize everybody else in the room knows more about the subject than you do. So bear with me. But I'd like to kind of talk about the atmospherics, touch a little bit on the details. I either had the happy irony or the disastrous fact of writing this and then looking at your agenda and realizing we were talking about the same subjects. So bear with me. There's a great affinity, of course, between the 5 freedoms in the First Amendment and FOI. FOI, freedom of information, the flow of information, the access to information, the right to hold government accountable is really the fuel, I think, for the engine that is the First Amendment, our core freedoms. The right to speak and write freely, to assemble and petition the government for change is dependent on the ability to access and also to understand the information that we can get from our public officials and our public bodies, because we are ultimately the ultimate authority. And that message, I think, is often either obscured, lost, or intentionally hidden from our fellow citizens by people with their own self-interests. Or, you know, frankly, just the tendency of an institution to want to carry on, to want to sustain itself, to avoid embarrassment. You know, I will have to tell you, after a lifetime of drifting in and out of coverage of government, reporting on state legislatures in my home state of Indiana, covering Congress, looking at the Tennessee legislature, at times askance, Frank and Ken. You know, I don't impart to the majority of those folks, or the majority of the employees who have records, a negative or an evil intent. But I think they have all too often the very human desire to portray themselves in the best possible light, not to emphasize their failings. God knows I'm not going to talk today about all the places I've done a crappy job. We just have a tendency to want to put our best foot forward. Sometimes that is all that drives the inability to get records, the obfuscation when one files a request, the delay that one runs into. Now, it can be more sinister than that, certainly. Now, I'm also aware I'm speaking to the choir, but there's nothing wrong with singing in a chorus occasionally to get our minds off the daily task. I think that's kind of fun at times. So I would implore, indulge, that you will indulge me in maybe congratulating you as well as pointing out the hurdles, because we have, in many ways, from the time I was a pup, come a long way. Certainly since that, was it July 4th, 66, when FOIA was signed? Think about that environment in which there was no guarantee, no guarantor of access to information on the federal level. Think of all the states where FOI is still, shall we call it, a developing concept, not just in Wisconsin. And frankly, the places where we're refighting the battles. You know, that half century in which we've had these laws on the books, largely. Remind me that in all things, there's action, reaction, reaction to the reaction, an ebb and flow, a push and pull that we find, I think, very difficult sometimes as a society to sustain. We live in a kind of a microwave society, you know, put it in the oven, push the button, 30 seconds later it's done, and we're on to something else. Legislation, lawmaking, interaction between citizens and government isn't like that. It is a constant tug. It is, we have this, then we don't. It is, we want that, and we can't get it right now. We can get it later. We proudly proclaim it, only to find it slips through our grasp. Law is only what we make it. You know, there is a statute book, there are ordinances, but ultimately they really depend on the people who enforce them and the people who demand enforcement, and then the people who come by to correct and adjust and make better those initial attempts. We're in that phase. I don't know, you know, there's a tendency in our internet-driven era to call everything 2.0 or whatever. I think we may be on 32.0 when it comes to FOI. But think about trends that are wafting through our society. There's that catch-all on the national level, national security. You know, it's sheltered more illegal wars, more criminal conspiracies, more simple incompetency than just about any other term I can imagine. But in a post 9/11 world, it has tremendous currency on the state as well as federal level, the local level. There's a Colorado circumstance, I understand, where companies went out of business because they could no longer get weather forecasts for the trails in the Rocky Mountains under the aegis of national security. I guess terrorists pausing to hike while they were doing something. But, it shelters in a court decision just announced the historical data about the Bay of Pigs invasion. One would think that it's time to sort of examine that in a detailed way. Enough time has passed. I suppose I know there are still people around who participated, but a court recently said that because a technicality, because a voluminous report was merely a draft of a yet obscure and hidden report, that it could not be circulated because we'd all be confused by the fact that it was a draft, and that was literally it. More seriously, the arrest and trial of those who would do this country harm are under the guise of national security being held and conducted. The Reporters Committee has done work on this so well. I'm really tempted to just say stop and say, ask Lucy, but on all of this, I should say. By the way, let me add my moment of tribute to your work. Just the other day, an inquiry into the relationship between Google and the National Security Agency was turned back, a Freedom of Information request about just some attendant data and communications about Google and NSA was turned back by a court, which probably in terms of judgment rightfully cited the fact that there's now a congressional exception that says they don't even have to show why they don't want to tell you. There's no requirement of a showing because the information is so sensitive. More on that later. And the atmospherics, along with national security, is privacy. There's a buzzword to set our toes to tapping across society. And truly, in a world where a mere swipe of a card or a touch of a keyboard can expose your life or your reading habits or what have you on Facebook to the world, I understand that concern. But it's an excuse for secrecy by those who turn legitimate public interest into something that really is almost the specter of invasion. We forget the reason the founders provided for a free press and for ultimately is, I guess, really only about, 40, 50 years ago, our right to be in a courtroom, is they saw government as having that potential to do great harm and the necessity for citizens to be able to access that information and to pull from those courts and to be present in those courtrooms, not to invade the privacy of a defendant or the right of a defendant to a fair trial, but to guarantee that the majestic and awesome power of the state to deprive us of life, liberty, and even death, our life and property, that had to be counterbalanced by the presence of the public to be sure those things were going on. They had experience with star chambers and secret trials and kingly edicts. And yet we've allowed our critics of free flow of information, to use a catchphrase, to portray us at times when we request public documents, when we are present in an official hearing, when we are there to observe the actions of a court, to portray us as invasive and detrimental, when in truth we are there as the only real lever on the power of an institution that can take away, limit, restrict, remove our most basic freedoms. Add in a fear of new technology. We had that great discussion today about videos and cell phones and police officers and what have you. And, new technology is driving tremendous concerns. There's a doctrine that doesn't really exist in law, but which is called, in my way of thinking, the doctrine of practical obscurity. To some degree, FOI advocates benefited from that because we just didn't quite remind people that all that information was out there, that we were getting authority under law to look at it. So they didn't feel squeamish. But advocates, for example, of, as in they did in Tennessee and so many other states, to hide gun registrations from public view, highlighted that fact. And with the somewhat, to me, illogical argument that if you had a gun in your house and that was publicly disclosed, you were somehow more vulnerable to being burglarized. I'm not sure if I were a burglar, I'd go down the list of gun owners, say, there's a guy who's got 4 shotguns, let's get that one. But I understand there were some other arguments about, you know, people who were asleep and not with their hand on the trigger, and what have you. But you can see the argument there. Somehow, what the Memphis Commercial Appeal did in holding people in Shelby County accountable for the registrations in that county, I believe it was, only the county, I think, Frank. Was it statewide? And they found innumerable issues where felons, people who were mentally incompetent, and for other reasons should have been denied permits were granted them. There would have been no such disclosure from the state. And yet, that newspaper was virulently attacked. And ultimately, those records are no longer available. And there's a move to even expand it. Of course, we're also putting guns in bars and other things, so more on that from Tennessee. This spasm of actions against citizens and journalists with cell phones and professional equipment is just mystifying to me. Although I will tell you, well, I might as well, you already let the cat out of the bag. 1973, I was on an interstate near Marion, Indiana, taking pictures of an accident, was handcuffed and put in the back of a police car by a deputy whose brother-in-law, I believe it was, I may have that wrong, but relative, was somehow involved in the accident under the guise of interfering with legitimate police investigation. We didn't know enough at the time. We thought it was, actually my colleagues in the newsroom thought it was funny. And catch and release then took place in a matter of moments and when other officers showed up. But it's been going on for a while. But now, with this new arrival of technology, the secrecy aspect of what goes on in public, as it was said, I think, toward the end, of public officials doing public job in public in some of the most serious matters, the concept of that being called private, or Illinois wiretap laws that were written to handle situations more appropriate to Al Capone than Mark Zuckerberg, being employed to shut down news coverage is just appalling. Let me not be so negative. There's a tendency to do that. There are those in Congress and elsewhere, and you all, pushing for better, more open, faster FOI laws and responses, and those gain traction in various ways. There are new systems. The new technology that some fear brings us information in a way that was inconceivable, 20, 25 years ago. The ability to from home access court records, federal and state documents. I mean, you just couldn't do that. You had to go down, as I did as a young reporter in Greenfield, Indiana, and open up those dusty books under the watchful eye, usually glaring eye of a county clerk or an assistant clerk or somebody who was stuck watching you, or in a little room where there was no advice, no direction. Those are gone. Advocacy groups are there that didn't exist to push and hold government accountable. There's an expectation in our society now of transparency that didn't exist. You know, we never dreamed that we could take pictures of police with our cell phones because there weren't any cell phones. We never would dream of access to databases on the federal and state level in the fashion. You had to drive to the state capitol. You had to find the office. Now we can do that from our homes. And on the news side, a colleague of mine, Ken Paulson, in a column written for Sunshine Week, cited some examples in Sarasota as well as in Milwaukee. Newspaper reporters are reviewing thousands of documents, and they've exposed reporters with extensive records of public complaints that have been hidden, just out of sight, practical obscurity, on the books but not known. Those serious misdeeds are often followed only by minor reprimands. They're on the job. You look at it and you wonder why. That's disclosed. Los Angeles Times reviewed official records of agencies and found tens of millions of dollars of waste in flood preparation and in planning. New York Times investigation of 13,000 allegations of abuse in 1 year in group homes in that state. found that fewer than 5% of those complaints had been referred to the police. All possible by information freely available to an advocate for the public. I grew up in a town, South Bend, it was mentioned earlier, with the newspaper had the name Tribune. I always loved that. In the Roman Senate, the Tribune spoke for the people, so that's a particularly favorite name of mine. Bloomberg News, not just because they're one of the sponsors, a happy coincidence, as it were. I was a judge in the Scripps Howard journalism competition this year, and they pierced the secrecy of one of the most intractable federal operations, the Federal Reserve, with, unbelievable number of documents. I don't know if a Bloomberg rep is here. Is it 50,000 documents? To look at what really happened as the financial system was collapsing and what the Fed was doing. And it's an extraordinary disclosure. We never would have learned without access to those documents. I want to talk about one other aspect that sometimes doesn't get mentioned, but which I think might be very near and dear to your hearts, and that is two people we should keep in mind, Jonathan and Susan Austin, not household names, even by their own admission. They run a small newspaper in Burnsville, North Carolina, the Yancey County News. They actually were the selection, I was on the committee, for the First Amendment, Distinguished Service to the First Amendment by the Scripps competition this year. And what they did, husband and wife, two-person, they had $30 in the bank, by the way, when they got the announcement of the $10,000 Scripps prize, so they was like, yeah. But they got the 2012 Edward Willis Scripps Award because in 1 year, they held county government accountable for the first time in the history of that county. It has a somewhat, shall we say, governmentally incestuous history. The sheriff is third generation in that office, and there are people who sort of expect to be reelected and are, in fact, reelected through the use of public records and some good reporting. And if you get a chance to visit the Scripps Award site, it's just a joy because they don't just say the police were unavailable. They say we went in and asked the lieutenant who referred us to the sergeant, and then we went to the sergeant and he referred us to the watch commander. And they go through this, and you're sitting on their shoulder as they write about it. It's fabulous. But they use public records to find a pattern of fraud and abuse in the use of absentee ballots. Picture this. While our esteemed colleagues who work for large news organizations were using computer-assisted reporting and large numbers of staff relatively, imagine all of the absentee ballots, I think it was 3,000 in this county, spread out between their living room and kitchen on the floor. And they are going along matching records and travel documents and signatures, and it's a remarkable job of old-fashioned shoe leather reporting, made possible by the fact that they could not be denied access to those public records. They found improper procedures, well, shall we say a range from improper procedures to outright fraud. They also found, through the use of records, that deputies were pawning their guns in other counties, raising money and then reporting them as lost and getting a new gun. So it's a really interesting technique, I have to admit. Hadn't heard that one. Well, I wish I could continue on the positive veins, but Society of Professional Journalists just recently did a survey in Washington of journalists, and the headlines on that survey were, quote, overwhelming frustration from journalists trying to interview federal employees or get basic information for the public. And that highlights another dilemma of our either 2.0 or 32.0, whatever society, is that we have won in some cases, but cannot be satisfied with merely having access to reams of data and databases and data dumps. Because, as I said, there is push back. Now it's the experts who can interpret that data who are being withheld, or being minded by a public affairs person, or being instructed and coached prior to an interview or a discussion with a citizen. Think climate change, well, just about any controversial subject, water quality. We're no longer fighting to get the information. We're fighting to get to the people who can tell us what the information means. I don't think that it's outrageous to expect the public officials we pay with public money to gather public information and to be concerned about public health and safety and other interests, to interpret to the public what that data means. And yet that's going on. Two-thirds of the reporters said agencies outright prohibit reporters from interviewing agency employees most or all of the time. That's an extraordinary finding from people who cover the federal government. 84% said, by the way, there was a public affairs person hovering over their shoulder. I'm sure it was only to be sure that things went well. I mentioned the CIA and the courts, the NSA decision. We're finding public officials who are very, very good, very, very smart, are finding ways to counter the efforts those of you in this room and others have made. I think it won't be long before the issue of cell phones, this is my paranoid fantasy or horror story, that we find the same technology that can blanket cell phone use in this room, should we choose to do it, will be right there on the dashboard cam to within a certain area prohibit signals and emails and perhaps even video recordings within a certain zone, so that that figurative zone that the previous, not the literal zone rather, that the previous panel talked about may become a technological zone in which there is effectively a white noise which prohibits citizens from filming close or news professionals, and only the official cameras will be able to record in that environment. I don't think that's outside the realm of today's technology, just to make a little more paranoid moment there. From SPJ to the Union of Concerned Scientists to the Reporters Committee, these new battle lines are being drawn. It is a new challenge, a new call to arms, and in some ways it's much more difficult. It's somewhat akin to the civil rights movement. You know, when there were those blatant denials of rights of our fellow citizens, when there were fire hoses and dogs, it was a motivating circumstance to people who might have otherwise been content to let the situation go on, not realize the danger to their own freedoms. Today, when we're talking about not access to information, but parsing the information or access to an expert, it's a harder argument to make. It is a new challenge. It is one that we will face in the next decade. When a perfectly reasonable Reporter Shield Law proposal, rooted in practicality and in place effectively in almost every state, is denied at the federal level because of the actions of, I think, if I may, one Julian Assange, which outweighs the interests of 300+ million Americans in knowing what their federal government is doing through people who talk to the press. That's a new battle. That's not the old battle lines. You know, we have an administration which many are loath to criticize for their position on FOI, frankly, for fear of losing the ground that has been gained, and I understand that. But if you look at an administration which, in some ways, has set a new high or low in pursuing those who will speak out of turn, and in closing off access to those who would interpret data, while trumpeting the successes of posting databases online, whose very agency, when you look at Congress, OGIS, proposes rather tepid improvements, and those are withheld until there's a threat of a congressional subpoena. I find it hard to be heartened by the advances that have been made on the federal level. Let me finish by touching on the complexities of the arguments that now will confront us as opposed to those earlier days. I don't know, they weren't the good old days, but they were the earlier days. And it's going to be discussed this afternoon. So let me weigh in on that, and that's Citizens United. I almost feel like I should pause and wait for the underlying hiss when I mention that name. But I think the court got it right. I think the court held that citizens, united in whatever way, have a right to speak out on the election of federal office holders. And in doing so, if you read the decision, they acknowledged that it was going to open a floodgate of funding. But it empowered a set of voices who were not to be denied a voice in the marketplace of ideas simply by being effective or well-funded. My issue with Citizens United isn't really with the decision, the circumstance of the group. It's with the lack of transparency around the way campaigns are funded. You know, on just a real life level, I can write a check in Madison today at the hotel lobby. And before I get to my room, it's somehow magically transported into a little picture in my checking account, and the money's deducted? Why does it take so long to get information about contributions to political candidates? It ain't the technology, folks. The answer, of course, is the political will. Harnessing transparency and technology to a well-crafted FOI legislation requiring that immediate disclosure would really let us know if that grassroots campaign or petition is really rooted in our hometown or is just imported sod by the equivalent of filmmaker Mel Brooks' old conglomerate Engulf and Devour, which I still love that name for this. So here are our challenges. And I am very conscious of the fact that you have to live this environment by your dedication and by your employment and by your life's work. But take back the public image of FOI. Keeping public information public is a necessity that many of our citizens don't understand. They think of it as invasive. They think their driver's license, their autopsy reports for Aunt Tilly, the pictures from an accident scene, the gun registration laws, certain kinds of public accumulated data, not personal, but simply aggregated data, ought to be kept personal because it's that invasive press or those invasive advocates or those invasive bloggers. They don't understand the necessity to hold government accountable, that is the role. That is why we have these laws. It is not to sell newspapers, get television ratings, to make advocacy groups successful so they can do more fundraising. It is to protect the very stuff of our lives against incompetence, misdirection, or outright evil. Insist on access to information experts. Those are the people increasingly in our complex society who only know, they are the only ones who know what the data means. You know, when I was first covering the water departments, it was basically, does it look clear or is there a bunch of stuff in it? That was sort of the level of sampling as well as the level of accountability. Today, you need a chemistry degree to figure out what's coming out of the tap. We can pry the information loose. We need access to the people who tell us whether those chemicals are the proverbial witch's brew or harmless, at least as far as we know at the moment. We live in that transparent era. I think the tools for transparency are ever better. I think the public, in some ways, has come round to the idea of more disclosure, more information, more of their public records being known. But there are those who will exploit the fear that that can also bring. That transparency and open government needs to be defined not as inconvenient for the governors, but essential for the governed. I salute all of you who are here, work in that field. And frankly, I don't think it's hyperbole to say that the future and the fate of your hometowns, of your states and the Republic depends on this work, on your work. Thank you for doing it, and thank you for inviting me to be with you.
I'm Lucy Dalglish, president of NFOIC. Each year since 2003, NFOIC has paired with the Society of Professional Journalists to recognize a leader in state open government efforts. And this year, our judges have selected Toby Nixon, president of the Washington Coalition for Open Government and a city council member in Kirkland, Washington, for induction into the State Open Government Hall of Fame. Toby, who also has served in the House of Representatives in the state of Washington from 2002 until 2006, is only the second public official that we have selected for the Open Government Hall of Fame. During his time as a Washington legislator, he sponsored 13 bills supporting more open government and also served as a ranking member of the House Committee on State Government Operations and Accountability, which under his leadership passed 17 election reform bills. Toby was nominated by his colleagues at the Washington Coalition for Open Government, which is the state member for NFOIC, for which he has served as president since 2007. During his time at WCOG, how do you guys pronounce it? WashCOG? WashCOG? All right. See, I'm from VCOG. You're WashCOG. Okay. During his time at WashCOG, he has built the organization into one of the most effective state coalitions in the country. This organization played an instrumental role in the 2010 U.S. Supreme Court ruling in Doe versus Reed, which affirmed a lower court ruling that disclosure of the identity of petition signers does not violate the First Amendment. WashCOG has also filed 9 amicus briefs to support other open government cases in Washington appellate courts, tracked more than 75 bills in the Washington State Legislature, and significantly expanded public outreach by hosting an annual state open government conference. Fighting numerous appeals and court cases to ensure the release of the public records, Toby's hard work in the Doe versus Reed case paid off in November when the records were finally released to the public. One of the judges for this year's award, Mike Farrell of Kentucky, said of Toby, "Anyone who aspires to be an open government hero should meet Toby Nixon and learn his story. He has lived government transparency as a public official and invested countless hours of his life as a private citizen advocating, strategizing, and involving others in efforts to keep government accountable to voters." One of our other judges, Charles Davis from Missouri, who you might recall was the former executive director of NFOIC, says that Toby Nixon is the embodiment of citizen involvement in FOI. He has, despite an incredibly busy schedule, stepped up time and time again and furthered the cause of government transparency in Washington State. The coalition there is a testament to his prowess as an organizer, and government in the state is more open, thanks in no small part to his volunteerism. And for those efforts, NFOIC is very pleased and proud to present the Hall of Fame Award to Toby Nixon. And Toby, before I let you say a few words, your friends from the Washington Coalition have sent you a gift. So there you go. Would you like me to give these to your wife?
Yes, that would be wonderful. Well, I deeply appreciate this honor, and it's a great honor to accept this award from you all. When I found out about it, the first question that came to my mind is, what does it mean to be a hero in this context? My wife will tell you that one of the things that gets me talking back to the television is hero inflation. I find that people get called heroes for doing just their ordinary job quite often these days. And for me, a hero is somebody who goes beyond the minimum expectations of the job and really does something beyond the call of duty, extraordinary things. And so I'd like to tell you about a couple of my heroes. This year is the 40th anniversary of the passage of Initiative 276 in Washington State, the initiative to the people that established our Public Disclosure Act. It was an all-volunteer effort. The people gathered double the number of signatures that they needed in order to get that initiative on the ballot without any paid signature gatherers. And it passed by 72% of the vote, one of the largest vote totals ever for an initiative in the state of Washington. That campaign was led by Bennett Feigenbaum, who was the chair of the original Coalition for Open Government in Washington State and the spokesman for the campaign, and by Michael Hilt, who was very young, in his 20s, who served as the executive director of both the the signature gathering process and of the campaign to pass it. He was also the attorney who led the effort to defend the initiative after it passed from the repeated attacks trying to overturn it. And he was the volunteer organizer who pulled together the group who made that happen. We, as the current Washington Coalition for Open Government, presented them with our highest honor earlier this year, the James Madison Award. I was not involved in the campaign for Initiative 276. In 1972, I was 13 years old, in 7th grade in junior high school in Redding, California. But that year was really my awakening to the importance of open government and to issues surrounding self-government. That year, I worked on the Citizenship in the Nation Merit Badge as a Boy Scout. And the Merit Badge counselor was a Superior Court judge, Richard B. Eaton. And I still remember coming into his office in the Shasta County Courthouse, this just gigantic office with beautiful wood paneling, a gigantic desk. And he sat me down and started talking about some of the fundamental principles of government. And he asked me to explain my understanding of the self-evident truths in the Declaration of Independence. And I recited to him the sentence that we are all so familiar with. You know, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And then I sat back very proud of myself. And he said, and go on. Well, that's it, Judge. Those are the self-evident truths, aren't they? And he said, no. And then he handed me a copy of the Declaration and said, read the rest of that paragraph. And then we spent the next hour going word by word, sentence by sentence, through that first paragraph of the Declaration of Independence. And he really opened my eyes to what it means, that we are all equal in the sense that none of us has a divine right to rule over the others, that the government was created to help us defend our rights. Our rights don't come from the Constitution or from the government. They predate the existence of government. That the government has only the power that we, the people, delegate to it. And in fact, the government can have no more power than any individual citizen. That we have the right, and in fact, not only the right, but the duty to alter or abolish the government if it becomes destructive of our rights. And we have a duty to be able to explain why it is that we are trying to alter or abolish the government. And to be able to do that, we need to be informed citizens. We need to have information. And he didn't do that just for me. He did that for hundreds and hundreds of Boy Scouts. That same year, my social studies teacher, Barbara Edelman, did very similar things for her class regarding the Constitution and the Gettysburg Address. And ever since that year, I have been passionate about preserving the things that our founders created. They instilled in me a love and a passion, and I have worked ever since to try to preserve and defend those things. I believe that passing along that passion is a duty that we all have as citizens. President Ronald Reagan said, "Freedom is never more than one generation away from extinction. We didn't pass it to our children in the bloodstream. It must be fought for, protected, and handed on for them to do the same, or one day we will spend our sunset years telling our children and our children's children what it was once like in the United States. where men were free. We have this responsibility. It is a duty of every American. If we don't do it, who will? In his second inaugural address, Ronald Reagan said, "If not us, who? And if not now, when?" And so I often ask myself, am I doing all that I can? Am I living up to that duty? Am I focusing my time and energy on the right things and really making a difference? And so am I a hero? Fortunately, it's not me to be the judge of that today. But I'm very grateful to the judges who have decided to present me with this award today. I'm grateful to the board members of the NFOIC and the Society of Professional Journalists. The things that I do, I could not possibly do by myself, and I'm very grateful also to the board members and volunteers of the Washington Coalition for Open Government. And most of all, I'm grateful to my wife, Irene, because without her support and her tolerance of my being away from home so much, I could not possibly do the things that I do. And I thank you all very much as well.